us now here on set. Oliver Farry from our International Affairs Desk. Oliver, let's talk about the talks first of all. No agreement after the talks. Why?
Well, mainly because there was a distinct lack of compromise and urgency on the part of both sides. Neither felt particularly compelled to make a move on the bigger differences separating them, and they both seemed fairly comfortable with kicking a decision on an agreement down the road a little bit. US Vice President J.D. Vance said that failure to reach an agreement was bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the US. They have chosen not to accept our terms. But Iran was similarly disinclined to budge. The main Iranian demand the US is refusing to grant concerns Iran's nuclear ambitions. Now, Washington says Iran must commit to not developing a nuclear weapon. Ironically, before the war, Iran protested that it was actually only developing enriching uranium for civilian purposes. But now Iran probably sees that, at least hardliners in Tehran, sees that after the war, it's in its interest to acquire a nuclear deterrent. Iran also wants international sanctions lifted, something that Washington and also its allies who were opposed to the war would also not be in favour of. And then, of course, there's the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran demands control of in any final settlement. Donald Trump says he doesn't care about the strait because the US doesn't need the oil, but rising oil prices are affecting consumers in the United States as much as they are anywhere else. And a final ancillary point is the lack of a ceasefire in Lebanon, which Israel has refused to include in the agreement, despite Pakistan initially saying would be part of it.
Donald Trump now then, since all of that, threatening to blockade the Strait of Hormuz himself. I mean, how on earth will that play out?
Yeah, in his Truth Social post on Sunday, Trump said he had instructed our Navy to seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that had paid a toll to Iran. Now, this is clearly a response to Iran's previous demands that it be paid a toll of $2 million per ship for safe passage through the strait. The US says it will start blockading the strait today, but it specified that only ships sailing to and from Iranian ports will be targeted. Now, it's worth pointing out that none of Washington's allies will be joining in the blockade, including the United Kingdom, which says that it's in favour of opening the strait up again, but it really wants to do probably go down a diplomatic route to do that. Now, as to how a blockade would work, the US will probably not target ships with munitions, but will probably intercept them and demand that their personnel be allowed board. Now, this is not insignificant, of course, because it probably risks triggering quite a number of diplomatic incidents. Traffic through the strait has been reduced to a trickle. Before the war, there were about 170 ships passing through each day. On Saturday, according to Iran, only 3 did so, and that was actually up from the number during the war.
So what next? I mean, how do we get out of all of this? More talks, is it?
It's unlikely to be the end of negotiations. Now, Donald Trump's told reporters that he didn't care if Iran walked away from the table. But there's also a risk of escalation again if things stagnate for too long. And the big problem is, as I said earlier, neither side feels any urgency to move things along. Ordinarily, a US administration would prefer to defuse a situation where fuel prices are continuing to rise and being extremely volatile. But as we've seen before, the Trump White House generally tends to observe its own reality, and there's very little immediate blowback for the Trump administration. The reckoning will probably come with the midterms in November, but that's still some time off. And Donald Trump might actually feel that that's a problem for the Republican Party, not for him. Even if the Republicans lose those elections, the worst that will happen to Donald Trump is his presidency becomes a lame duck one. But you could also argue that his self-inflicted wounds over the past 6 months have probably made him a lame duck president already without actually threatening his time in office, at least yet. Iran, for its part, has taken a severe pummeling in the war, but it is not completely defeated. Its defence capabilities are not decimated, despite what Trump says, and it's arguably even more hardline than before the war. So talks will inevitably resume at some point, but I would not rule out that violence starts again between the two sides, at least in a sporadic sense, before we actually see anyone sitting down again.
Oliver, thanks very much. Oliver Farry joining us there from our International Affairs Desk.